I'm Chance.
And I'm Sarah Catherine.
And this is Conservation Connection,
presented by Last Chance Endeavors.
We are a husband and wife team running a wildlife education nonprofit. It's focused on connecting students to their environment.
Each week, here on Conservation Connection, we do just that, introducing you to the groundbreaking science and conservation work that's happening every day across the globe.
We talk to professionals in the world of conservation science and wildlife management, and we ask them about their career,
their current projects,
their wild and crazy stories from the field,
and everything in between.
This episode is a collaboration with EarthX here in Dallas, Texas.
EarthX is the largest Earth Day celebration in the world, and it brings in speakers from every corner of the environmental arena.
Listen in to hear the stories of today's environmental titans, covering everything from environmental law, ocean health, renewable energy, clean transportation, and so much more.
Let's get to the show.
Welcome everybody to another EarthX episode of Conservation Connection. We're really excited. We were sitting down in a room with Dr. Mike Slattery. He is the director of the Institute for Environmental Studies at Texas Christian University. He is the mastermind behind the TCU Rhino initiatives, and he also does a lot of work at the tropical research station that TCU has in the cloud forests of Costa Rica.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Delighted to be here.
Thank you so much for making time here at the EarthX conference. Could you give us a little bit of a background of where you came from and how you got to TCU?
Yeah, sure. So I am South African born and raised and lived there for 24 years. Did my undergrad and honors degree in Johannesburg. And those degrees were in geography and environmental science broadly. So my training right from the outset was more of a generalist than a specialist, and interested in, the feedback cycles between how humans impact the environment and vice versa. And then did my graduate degrees overseas in Toronto and at Oxford. And then I taught in North Carolina for 3.5 years. And as always, most roads lead to Texas. And so
I'll agree with that.
There you go. And so in 1998, I got the opportunity to join the faculty at TCU and have not looked back.
That's a long and winding road. I'm glad you landed in my home state of Texas, which I love dearly. This generalist background that you have has really allowed you to be very nimble and very able to look at these environmental issues from lots of different lenses. So you kind of do a little bit of everything. What are some of your current focuses?
Well, there's really three for me. One is, and it's been an ongoing focus throughout my career, and it's where a lot of my research is on human impact on river systems. So I'm a fluvial guy. Fluvial just meaning, water-related issues. And so I've always been fascinated by water flowing downhill and sediment following along, as odd as that sounds. And so that's been a thrust of my research. But then over the years, and one of the great things about TCU is we focus not just on research. It's a very balanced institution between teaching and research. And so I've had the opportunity, which I'm very grateful for, to expand my horizons outside of the physical classroom into places like Costa Rica and South Africa. So, the research focus is still very much on rivers, but we do both teaching and research in Costa Rica, which I think would be my second big area of emphasis. Magical place, beautiful country, beautiful people, and very environmentally sound and astute. And so it's a wonderful sort of poster child, a living lab for the struggles that humanity faces between preservation of the environment and development, and how we balance that. And then the third one, which has been a real joy for me over the last 6 years, is to be involved back home in South Africa on the rhino conservation.
I would love to kind of take a deeper look into the research station in Costa Rica. If you could give us kind of an overview of the layout of that research station even, and some of the projects that you all focus on when you're there.
No, I'd love to. So in 2006, on one of my study abroads, our guide on the trip, who's a National Geographic guide, said to me one day that, why don't we stop by at my friend's farm? It's about an hour into the cloud forest. We need 4-wheel drives to get there. But he has this dream of opening a facility for students to become completely immersed, literally off the beaten track, completely disconnected from cell phone service, but utterly connected to the natural environment. And it sounded intriguing. And so we did. We just stopped by for a lunch, and he had started the structure. It's a fairly small farm. About 100 hectares, so that's about 240-something acres in American language. And he had started building this really gigantic treehouse in the canopy. And, one of the great joys for me was to then sit down with the students that night once we'd had our lunch and had left to another place. And I said to the students, got them all into my hotel room, and I said, look, this is just a gem sitting here waiting to be developed. Why don't I challenge you to write a grant to the university and see if we can help finish this station and make it our own? And
that's amazing.
Yeah, that's what they did. One of the wonderful things about TCU is we have a very flat structure, and it's very easy to go straight to the chancellor, who is just this broad-visioned guy who makes things happen, and it's very hard for chancellors to say no to students. So we planted the seeds with the students, and we got an injection of cash to finish out the facility, build 2 faculty cabins in a primary rainforest. TCU doesn't physically own it. The owner, who's also a National Geographic guide and an ecologist, he owns it. But we call it our own. We do all the maintenance. We provide all the infrastructure. And other universities are welcome to use it. But we go in there and immerse these students in field teaching. And they do some ecologically based research. But we've also had several graduate students do their theses down there, ranging from 3-dimensional modeling of the hydraulics of the rivers, which again comes back to my first love. We've had students digging soil pits and looking at the chemical, physical changes in soils under primary and secondary growth, all the way through to students doing studies on ecotourism. So again, broad.
Very broad.
It's this amazing place where you connect, unlike I ever have in a cloud forest. Yeah.
And it sounds like you're not just connecting with nature, you're disconnecting from this kind of highly technological, constantly communicating world.
Yeah, everything's just such instant gratification. And, we make these students do all the measurements by hand, and they have to do all the calculations by hand, and they have to plot all of the data, physically drawing X and Y axes in a field notebook. And they tear their hair out because they realize they could do this in under a minute on an Excel spreadsheet, but it takes them a day. But they get to really understand their data and take great pride in what this field notebook looks like at the end of the program. They've got a sort of pride and ownership of the data and what they've done. It's a bit sort of old school, but I think it's good for them.
Sometimes the old ways are good ways.
No, absolutely.
A personal anecdote from that. I love photography. Digital photography is something that I've been in for a long time. But I was actually the last grade in my high school to learn on 35 millimeter film and to use enlargers and to use chemical baths to develop our own stuff. And I know without a shadow of a doubt that I am a much better photographer for understanding the analog way that it was done before it got so easy with digital cameras. When you only have 24 exposures on a roll of film, you're not sitting there snap.
Gotta think about it.
Right? You're thinking about it. You're measuring things, and you're really, really putting a lot of focused thought into it. And I love that even though you could do it in an Excel spreadsheet, that they get the experience of really deep diving into that data analysis by hand. That's, I'm sure, not great at the time experientially, but it's got to give them so much pride in what the work that they're doing.
Yeah. No, it absolutely does. Couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Something I love about this podcast, Conservation Connection, is that we hopefully give access to people who didn't even know that this program existed, and they don't know that these opportunities are out there. And if they're looking at, what school do I want to go to? What do I really want to study? Hopefully someone may hear this and be like, this program sounds like exactly what I want to do. I know that probably would have been me if I had heard this episode and I was like, yep, want to go to TCU and I want to study in the environmental science department.
It's I'm glad you said that, and thanks for that. It's and there are many great schools, right? And I think what I would encourage any young person out there who's looking at university, obviously we'd love to have them at TCU, but is to look beyond just the degree program, to look beyond the formal webpage and make contact with the department and ask those kind of questions. What collaborative field immersive opportunities are there outside of a particular department? Because departments can be very, territorial and turf oriented. We work in these academic silos, but very often there's these sort of collaborative, integrative programs across departments. And I've been, quite, I think, focused on building those types of programs. And, and that's why when we go to Costa Rica and South Africa, I never limit it to just environmental science majors, because taking 14 tree huggers to the cloud forest is great. But, it's a pretty easy audience. But if you're dealing with, difficult environmental issues, you need a broad range of perspectives, and you need some people to ask some probing questions, and you need business people to go, hang on a second, how do we wrap a business model around that organic farm when clearly it's not sustainable? Those types of things that make for a richer experience. So I really encourage students to drill down into the programs and see what kind of study abroad, semester abroad, international programs are available.
Now, before we move on from this topic, just for my knowledge, can you define a cloud forest?
It's a forest in the clouds. I mean, it's a tropical rainforest, but it's at an elevation where the tree line is essentially permanently in the cloud base. Now, that's not strictly true because, clouds disappear and come back, but most of the precipitation and the moisture is directly, very closely linked to the cloud base that sits on and within the canopy, as opposed to storm systems or clouds that may be several, 100,000 feet above the forest, and you get convective, strong thunderstorms. This is more of a long, prolonged, continual feeding of the hydrologic cycle from the clouds that wrap around the forest. And our research station is at an elevation where it's, right in the base of the cloud forest. But interestingly, with climate change over the last 2 decades, the owner of the station has noticed how that cloud forest base has began lifting.
Oh, wow.
And so that has dramatically changed the water supply to the forest. So we're able to observe and measure real-time changes despite all of the denial in many parts of the world, especially here in the United States. Climate change is absolutely tangible in places like this.
Okay, so as much as I would love to talk about Costa Rica and cloud forests, and there's a whole bunch of I did herpetology in my undergrad, so Costa Rica, the amphibians that are there and what happened with them in chytrid fungus is fascinating. I'd like to move on
to bigger things.
to not necessarily bigger, but the next thing.
Yeah.
I would love to hear more about the Rhino initiative that you have going on here at TCU.
Yeah, so this developed, like many things, sort of serendipitously. TCU had has just finished a program called Global Innovators. And what that was the Board of Trustees freed up some money for faculty to innovate and come up with initiatives and programs that would be either, too expensive to capitalize through normal research granting agencies. But this program was interesting because every semester they would choose a region of the world and they'd say, okay, here's a particular region, preferably a developing region. And they would ask for competitive proposals from faculty to identify a person doing extraordinary work on the ground, bring them to TCU, not just for a 1-hour lecture and wave goodbye, but to bring them for a week and then immerse them in our culture and get them to work very closely with our students. But then most critically, once we sent them back to their developing country or region, to figure out how we can turn around and support their program long term. And it turns out that in November of 2013, it was Southern Africa. And so I saw this and I thought, I've been waiting for a long time to find the right outlet to take my students back to South Africa. And things changed, evolved very quickly. I Skyped my brother who lives in Port Elizabeth on the southeastern seaboard. I explained the program. I said I wanted to do something that was not political, preferably something that was conservation oriented, but had a strong human dimension to it. And he was the one who turned me on to Dr. William Folds, who is a wildlife vet in the region. I'd heard of him, and I emailed him. Within 24 hours, we had a Skype date and an agreement that he would come over to TCU. So it was an incredible set of circumstances, and we brought him over in April of 2014, and he really transformed our community. He gave multiple lectures, multiple seminars, worked with several schools, and we worked him very hard for a week, but he changed a lot of our careers by tapping into this crisis, this environmental human catastrophe that's developing in South Africa. And so, I again went to the dean, went to the provost and the chancellor and said, hey guys, how about we start this initiative? And it would take a study abroad and to get that going. And then it evolved into something much bigger than just simply taking students to the field.
Can you give me an overview of some of the threats that rhinos are facing and I know that it's an incredibly complex issue. There's lots of human factors, lots of environmental factors. What are some of the big things that we're looking to solve right now?
Well, as it pertains to the rhinos specifically, they are quite literally under the gun here from poaching. So this is all part of a very large global trade in wildlife products. And we think that trade is somewhere between 8 to 25, maybe even $30 billion a year. It's one of the largest environmental crimes. We think about deforestation as one. But the trafficking of wildlife is another. And we can start putting in ivory and lion bones and pangolin scales and shark finning and, turtles, you name it. So it's this enormous global trade in products, most frequently funded and fueled by crime syndicates, international crime syndicates. And you're right, the word complex is really relevant here because it's not just a couple of poor people running around the African bush killing an animal. It's a very, very well orchestrated, well funded set of networks. But specifically with rhinos, they're under threat because their horns are enormously valued in Southeast Asia for all sorts of reasons. And so that is providing an enormous demand and has done so for about a decade, where the demand has been created to get the products into Vietnam and China, and the supply country happens to be South Africa, which is home to about 2/3 of all the world's rhinos. So that species is specifically now under real threat, and I know environmentalists sometimes tend to overstate their case, but I think it's not overstating the case that within a decade or two, we're looking at this species being gone unless we solve this problem. So that's the direct and specific threat to the rhino.
So a large hope with the TCU Rhino initiative is to basically kind of put this back into the hands of the people in South Africa, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, so the hope is that they take care of this issue and care about the issue themselves.
That's correct, and that is absolutely the end point. So when someone says to me, what is the solution, right? You've just nicely captured what the solution is. The problem is that solution is sometime down the line. We don't know how far down the line that is, but it's multiple years and probably decades down the line. And so we're now in this time crunch between trying to make that solution a reality, but at the same time wrap as much protection around these animals so we can buy ourselves time to figure out how to put these animals back into the hands of Africans. I know that can sound condescending, that the West knows the answers and we're going to solve this by putting the future of Africa's animals back into the hands of Africans themselves. But they know it. This is their natural heritage, right? So why is this happening? Well, it's happening because we don't have any alternatives for them. Poverty and habitat fragmentation are rife. And when someone in the bush gets approached by a poacher or a poaching syndicate to not even necessarily go and poach an animal, but just tell them where these animals are, and they can get the equivalent of something like 1 to 4 years of salary just by telling them that, and then put food on the table for their family for the next year or more. That's an easy decision. I would probably make the same decision. So that's what we're up against. Whenever I talk about the rhino crisis, and what I've learned over the last few years is that most people have that visceral reaction, well, let's just arm everybody and go and shoot poachers. We're not going to be able to shoot our way out of this crisis, no matter how sophisticated our helicopters and our drones and any of that is. We can't fight our way out of this. We can certainly begin to hopefully stem the tide of poaching, and at the same time we have to tackle the demand reduction in Southeast Asia. We have to try and rehabilitate and protect these animals as best we can. But it all simply comes down to finding a way for these local communities to protect them themselves in the long run. And in South Africa is an interesting one, right? Because there's still such a very strong legacy of apartheid there. And how could we expect a local to see an intrinsic value to a rhino when they don't have a job, their parents didn't have a job, the value of them as a human being is based simply on was based simply on the color of their skin. They see the rhino as the white man's rhino, not the black man's rhino. And so we have to change that quickly. And that's going to come through socioeconomic change.
I think that brings up a really good point. And in my personal journey with conservation and learning to care about the natural world, I think most people go through these levels of understanding where you see an animal and you think, oh, that's really cool. I want to take care of it. Mm. And you learn that they're under threat from something like poaching. And so you say, oh, well, let's just make it illegal, or let's protect the animals, just the animals. Let's put armed guards by it. And then you come to realize that the problem doesn't necessarily lie in that behavior. That is a symptom
Correct.
Of an underlying cause. And going back to the idea that someone can walk up and offer 1 to 4 years salary to somebody who is struggling financially, who is just, their concern is keeping their family alive.
Right.
That is a basic human desire. And the issue comes in that we have to find ways to solve that problem. That's the problem you have to solve. in order to protect the animals that we want to protect. You have to go all the way back to the root instead of just dealing with the symptoms of this issue.
That's absolutely right. And so that has a long historical precedent. And now we're suddenly up against this very short time frame to try and do this. And, many of these eco-reserves, these game reserves, which are not hunting reserves, so you bring tourists in for this wonderful African experience and they sit at sunset and have a gin and tonic and watch the animals at the watering hole, and they pay huge amounts of money for that privilege because it's very expensive to run a game reserve. To someone living in a local community that doesn't have potable water or electricity, you sit there and go, well, what about me?
Right.
How do I benefit from this wildlife unless I'm an active game ranger or I'm an owner of a game reserve? You're very peripheral to the whole thing, and that's why we support some programs on the ground that are focused on awareness of school kids, bringing school kids into the reserve for the very first time in their life to ever see an elephant or a rhino. That's where we have to make the change.
I mean, if you've never seen it, even if it's your country's animal, it's not your animal.
Absolutely.
And just that simple connection of, oh, that's right here. That's got to be so powerful.
Yeah, no, it really is.
Yeah.
It really is.
And so this program has been going on for about 4 years, 4 or 5 years?
A little long, yeah.
Yeah. Have you seen an impact since the beginning to now?
I have, and so that impact isn't measured in the metric of the number of rhinos that are poached every year in South Africa, because that number is still high and catastrophic, and it's controversial because we don't really know how many there are. We don't know where this tipping point really is between the numbers being poached and the natural births. But the impact that I've seen, one, in my students, everyone that comes back from that trip is an advocate. Some go on to do other things that are well outside of rhino conservation. But I know everyone, we've turned every one of those young men and women into advocates for wildlife conservation. So that's been very powerful. And several have gone on to do really great things. Like our Vietnamese students that we take on the trip have gone back to Vietnam and done, multiple presentations at high schools and sort of galvanized. And we're just one speck on the map of conservation here, but that's been very powerful. Certainly resources are important. At the end of the day, it doesn't, we don't want to just talk about money, but there's a hard reality. And the reality is, if you are a game reserve that wants to offer the quintessential African experience, and many people from overseas, rightly or wrongly, want to come and see the so-called big five, right? These big animals that are the lion and the leopard and the African buffalo and the elephant and the rhino. Those are the so-called big five. Then as a reserve, you'd better have those big five animals. Well, to have rhino now costs so much to protect. So the reserves we work with are directing something like 40 to 50% of their annual operating budget just to protection, right? Fencing, trackers, the collars that we have to put on the animals, the anti-poaching units, the salaries, the drones, the aerial surveillance, you name it, the dog units, the equine units. It's very, very expensive work. And so if you're losing 50% of your budget, then something's got to give.
Yeah.
So I've seen an impact there where we've been able to leverage the resources of TCU, the very generous donations of some of our alumni, and some of which I've taken to the field, which has been a great way to inspire people, not to be sort of shady about it and pretend that you're trying to get into people's pockets, but to say to people who have means, and there are lots of people who have means here, and not just people of means, but people who want to help. They want to find avenues to make their money work. And so I have no shame in, spending time with wealthy people who want to make a difference. But it's got to resonate with them, So I've seen impacts on the grounds where, we're now able to begin to direct resources to protection at the reserve we're working at and cover things like collaring and medical procedures where the game reserve can then direct their resources elsewhere where it's needed. So that's been really encouraging to see.
It's one step in a very long and complex solution, but it's certainly a very important step.
No, it is. Someone's got to get the ball rolling somewhere, and so that's been great to see that start.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that you say, you don't have any shame in taking money from people who have it, who want to make a difference. I saw a video recently with Steve Irwin, and he says, if you have the money to give me, I don't care where it comes from. I will take it and turn it into something good, something to help the planet.
Yeah.
And that's really that's really what matters, is what you do with that.
It is. It is what matters. It's an interesting comment, that, because for many people it does matter where the money comes from, right? And that's another ethical dilemma, that we have in wildlife conservation, and it raises issues of, hunting, and where does the hunting community fit in? That's a, can of worms. And the one thing that I've loved as being part of this initiative is to have the space to have those conversations. And that's one thing I will just, I know this seems like just a shameless plug, but I will give a plug to Trammel Crow and EarthX, because this has created that space to be able for people who are not interested in hunting at all, like me, to be able to sit down with people who do hunt and find some common ground and figure out what is the outcome. The outcome is we all want these animals alive, but also understanding that, there's a large proportion of the population where you say, well, we've got to shoot a few to save a lot. And some people go, well, I don't think that, I have no interest in that. And it's a very, very complex, difficult, emotional conversation to have. But yeah, at the end of the day, there's people here who really want to help and really want to make a difference. And we all have our causes, and this just happens to be mine.
That's something we've heard over and over and over and over here at EarthX, is that this space, this event, is such a level playing field for anybody from any walk of life to say, here's my issue. Let's have a conversation without being combative, without, it devolving into me versus you, but in becoming, let us together solve this problem.
Right.
So that you work from your end, I work from my end, and we come to a mutual agreement.
That's right, because we don't have the space for, what is sometimes referred to as intentional dialogue. We're shouting at each other. You're either watching CNN or you're watching Fox. We're yelling at one another. You're either wearing blue or you're wearing red, and we're demonizing all of this, right? And that's just not helpful, I think. And, I'm not trying to convert people either way. All I'm simply saying is our natural heritage is being stolen from under our feet. And at some point, we're going to have to wake up and go, hang on a second. The reality is, according to the World Wildlife Fund, more than 50% of the world's wildlife has gone since 1970. I mean, we are in a mass extinction here. There's no other way to put it. And we can either sit back and do nothing and squabble, or we can try and fix it.
We can realize that it affects all of us equally.
Yeah.
So no matter where you stand,
Yep.
The only way forward is working together.
Yep, 100%.
Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. We covered a lot of ground here.
Yep.
I think we could keep talking to you for about another hour, probably.
Good.
Easily.
Join us for episode 77 of the Rhino. That's right.
Exactly.
Part 93,
Yeah.
continuing.
Now, if people wanted to find your work or find more about you and these initiatives, where could they go to find this?
Yeah, so there's two places. One, I would go to environment.tcu.edu. So that's where the Institute is housed, and the Rhino Initiative and the Costa Rica Research Station are under that. So you'll see some stuff there. The other one, for the rhinos in particular, is planetrhino.com. It's a global portal. It was designed and it's funded and it's housed on the TCU servers. So it is certainly our initiative, but it's not meant to be TCU-centric. So it's a global portal for people to learn more about the crisis. And the website is informative, but we get a lot of our traction through social media. So through Facebook and through Twitter and through Instagram, and that is Planet Rhino. So if you go and look, just go and search for Planet Rhino. We push out probably something like 4 to 6 tweets a day, not just rhinos, but broad conservation pieces that people can engage in. So planetrhino.com is a great place for the rhino, and environment.tcu.edu.
If you're listening, check out the show notes. We'll have that link right down there. So just scroll down. You can get some more information if you're interested in that.
Thank you so much for being on the show with us today. We really appreciate it.
You bet. What a pleasure. Go Frogs.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conservation Connection.
If you enjoyed our podcast, go ahead and subscribe to make sure you catch every episode that we post.
We would love to hear from you. So if you want to reach out, go to our website, lastchanceendeavors.com/contact, and shoot us an email.
We love questions from our listeners, so if you heard something that you want to know more about, be sure to let us know.
We'll post bonus content that addresses your questions and gives you a little more information.
A big thanks to EarthX for hosting us, and a big thanks to you for listening. Don't forget to tune in next week.